My guest today is John Nicolas, a partner in Gadens Property Group. John primarily works with some of Australia's largest retail shopping centres and is an expert in property and commercial transactions, shopping centre development and retail leasing. I'm really excited to speak with John today about issues affecting the commercial and retail property sectors and what we can expect over the next 6 to 9 months. Thank you for joining me, John.
Thanks very much and good morning, everyone.
The retail and commercial property sector has been extraordinarily hard hit by the pandemic. Can you share some of the typical scenarios that you've come across?
Sure. It's quite interesting. Some areas have been very hard hit and others we're actually seeing some businesses do extremely well during the COVID period. So what we're more so seeing is a degree of uncertainty about what the future looks like. And that's really where the difficulties are arising at the moment. And that's where we're seeing parties to leases, for example, having some issues with figuring out what to do about the future. So they seem to be coping quite well at the moment and dealing with things at the moment, but it's what the future looks like that everyone is waiting to see. And that's where potentially we're going to see a lack of investment or a longer decision-making process on investment. And that could mean we don't see a lot of new businesses emerge, for example, and we may not see a great deal of development for the time being. That being said, there is still a degree of optimism in the market, and some developments that we've been working on for next year are still going ahead and going ahead quite strongly. So I think there's certainly some interesting time ahead. I think that SMEs we've seen generally forge ahead during the current period, and they are being well supported by their communities for those that are perhaps not in a CBD or a central location. So there is some positivity there, and I think that buy local, live local, shop local type mantra will continue, certainly at least while we're under some of these ongoing restrictions that we're currently facing.
On the 3rd of April, the National Cabinet introduced a mandatory code of conduct and stipulated that each lease must be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. How has this played out in a practical sense?
Look, the market was waiting for something like that. A lot of landlords and tenants were uncertain as to how to deal with the current times and their leasing arrangements. And we saw, again, a degree of relief when that code was released, because it at least gave the parties something to work with to work out how they would deal with each other. The difficulty with the code that was announced by National Cabinet was that it was to be implemented on a state and territory basis by the governments in each of those jurisdictions. Some of the governments have moved quicker than others to implement the code. And for example, here in Queensland, we're still waiting for the legislation to be implemented. We think it'll be later this week. What that has caused, though, is that a number of landlords and tenants, particularly those with national interests, have become confused or unsure about how to deal with things because they haven't had each state and territory pass through the relevant legislation. And what we're also seeing is that the legislation is inconsistent jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So certainly those with national interests are now facing a situation where early April they thought they had a solution that would allow them at least to move forward knowing what the outcome may be, to a situation now where each state and territory is very different, and of course each lease is being dealt with very differently as well. As for the approach, what seems to be happening is tenants and landlords that are trying to do the right thing are coming to an agreement much more quickly. Where we're seeing the sticking points are tenants and landlords who don't want to do the right thing, whatever that may be, and that is case by case, but certainly tenants who expect to pay no rent when they could have been open and trading, for example, are finding that landlords are not reacting particularly well to that. And likewise, where a tenant was forced to close, so for example, a gym or an arcade or games type business, they were forced to close by governments. Landlords are very much taking a much more sympathetic approach. And for those businesses that have charged on and continued to trade and tried to get through it, again, landlords are taking quite a sympathetic approach to them because they're in it together essentially, and they understand that those tenants are trying to do the right thing.
We're now starting to see businesses and retail getting back to work, albeit in different scenarios with social restrictions and and understandably, I think there's going to be reduced revenue for a lot of retail businesses, especially. How do you see this impacting commercial leasing ongoing?
Look, there's probably three different sectors that we need to look at there. There's the retail sector, the office or commercial sector, and then the industrial or logistics sector. From a retail perspective, a lot of retailers are redesigning the layout of their premises, redesigning the way that their premises flow to ensure that they can adhere to physical distancing requirements. But most retailers seem to be wanting to give it a go, and I think that's the most important part. On the revenue side of things, as I said earlier, we've seen some retailers unfortunately get impacted very badly, but others have in fact traded quite well through it, particularly in regards to online sales. And I think that online sales piece will continue to charge on with consumers finding that as a new way to buy. I don't think that necessarily means the death of physical premises. Australia is such a large country. We're so disparate in the way that our regional cities are located, that to try and set up a supply chain or a logistics network based purely on big warehouses, for example, may not work. So I think you'll find that there will still be bricks and mortar retailers or retail shops to allow that connectivity of supply for online sales if that's what really takes off. I do think that some of the shopping centre owners that have not invested in their assets more recently will be forced to invest in their assets to keep them relevant and current. I think that some of the bigger assets around town will perhaps look to move towards more a service-based offering, perhaps a medical, and certainly, there's not going to be that open it and they will come type mentality. That won't work anymore. Asset owners are going to have to work their assets hard to get the best benefit out of them. From an office perspective, there is a view that work from home has proven so successful that businesses are going to have to, or will look at getting rid of some of their office space. I'm not convinced that's right. We saw over the last 5 years, particularly, a move towards open plan and a more intense use of office space, so that you had people closer together, working in more open environments. What we're seeing with physical isolation or physical distancing is that that sort of model of fit out isn't going to work. And so we're having to literally de-intensify the use of office space so that people are able to maintain physical separation, particularly in the current environment. So I think that a number of businesses will still need the majority of the space that they currently have. Where I think things may change, though, is business owners may look at different locations. So rather than necessarily feeling like they need to be in the CBD, they may look at CBD fringe type areas, or they may look to parts of their business that don't need to be in the CBD, moving them to other locations that might be cheaper to secure in the way of rental. I also think, though, that as a result of what's happened to the economy, there unfortunately will be a number of insolvency issues. And I think we'll see a lot of professional services firms need to ramp up. And typically those sorts of firms are located in office buildings. On the industrial or logistics side of things, I haven't seen or heard of huge impacts there in the sense of, tenants needing to run away from their premises. But I think, going back to my earlier point about the new way that we might consume or do business, I think those industrial and logistic type sectors will remain strong as people look to perhaps bolster their supply chain and network.
Sounds to me that there's going to be lots of opportunity for transformation and positive change that's going to come out of it. And I think it's not really the death to retail or death to commercial property that some people have been talking about.
Look, I think businesses need to remain nimble, and if they are nimble, then those opportunities are there. And certainly through COVID-19, we've seen businesses be nimble. We've seen them adapt. We've seen them look at new ways of doing things. And as long as that spirit of entrepreneurship continues, then there will be opportunities there. And I think from a property ownership or management perspective, likewise, there needs to be that willingness to adapt. But of course, it all comes down to money being available. And we've seen governments be adaptable and nimble in response to this as well as banks and other sort of stakeholders. So if everyone can maintain that spirit of adaptability, looking to help each other out, then I think, without trying to use the cliche, if we're all in it together, then we will come out of it together. And the issue will be if any one party tries to get themselves the best deal to the detriment of others, that could be where it all comes apart. So the opportunity is there, but people need to leave something in the opportunity for others for it to work.
What advice would you give to legal teams right now, whether they be on the landlord side or tenant side?
Just be sensible. I think if either side goes into it thinking that they should have 100% win, then it's never going to work. I got told very early on in my career that a good mediated outcome or a good outcome is where both parties walk away unhappy. And I think if both parties approach it from that perspective, as negative as that may sound, then that probably means the process has worked. If a party walks away happy with how things have gone and the other party is terribly unhappy, whilst it may feel like the happy parties had a win, it's not sustainable. And to my earlier point, we need to look at solutions and arrangements that are sustainable so that we all do get out of it together.
Thanks very much for your time today, John. It's been great to speak with you and really appreciate your insights.
That's my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.